Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere you absolutely cannot Google your way out of. We're talking about Datura, a pretty little flowering weed that grows right there in your backyard, in vacant lots, along roadsides, and probably, if your neighbourhood has that one house, in someone's untended garden bed. It looks innocent. It smells kind of sweet. And it will, without a single moment of hesitation, send you into a screaming, days-long psychosis where you cannot tell what is real, hold a conversation with people who don't exist, forget that you have a body, and try to smoke cigarettes that aren't there. Now before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and a truly heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and you have made some choices in your search history that I respect deeply. Suggestions like yours are genuinely what keep this channel going, so thank you from the bottom of my very non-hallucinogenic heart. Also, we're now on Spotify, so if you prefer to let this wash over you through headphones while staring at a ceiling, the link is in the description. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is always 2 in the morning somewhere. Now go ahead and dim those lights, turn on a fan, pull the blanket up, make sure your feet are tucked in, because tonight we are spending time with one of the most terrifying plants that has ever had the audacity to be beautiful. Let's take a moment to think about this. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to lose your grip on reality? Not the fun, floaty kind, but the full, sobbing in a bush kind? Have you ever wanted to know what happens when a plant tricks your entire nervous system into believing that the room is on fire, your dead grandmother is sitting in the corner knitting, and your hands have turned into someone else's? What kind of person throughout history decided to eat this thing on purpose? What did ancient priests see in their visions? What did soldiers experience when enemies poisoned their food with it? Could one single plant really launch a person into 3 days of full psychosis? And more importantly, why does it still grow freely right now? Probably within walking distance of wherever you're lying down. Congratulations. You have just woken up next to a Datura plant. It is blooming. It smells like something between a funeral flower and a dare. And somewhere, across thousands of years of human history, someone is already reaching for it. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning, which in Datura's case means standing in a field and looking at something that has absolutely no business being as gorgeous as it is. Datura stramonium, known by names like Jimson weed, devil's trumpet, thorn apple, and hell's bells, grows as casually as dandelions in disturbed soil across North America, Europe, Asia, and pretty much anywhere on Earth that has the audacity to have dirt. Its white or pale purple trumpet-shaped flowers spiral open at dusk, like something out of a Gothic fairy tale, and the plant itself is tall, dark-leafed and dramatic in the way that only something deeply dangerous can afford to be. It does not hide, it does not warn you, it simply exists, stunning and patient, waiting to be touched, smelled, or, in the decision that has ended badly for thousands of people throughout recorded history, eaten. The whole plant is toxic. Not some parts. Not the roots in high doses. All of it. The leaves, the stems, the seeds, the flowers, the roots. Every single component of this plant contains the same cocktail of alkaloids in varying concentrations. Even the nectar can carry enough of a charge to affect bees, which is why Datura honey, produced in regions where the plant grows abundantly, has historically caused problems for people who assumed they were getting something sweet and innocent. There's nothing innocent here. The plant has simply learned to look like there is, and it is genuinely beautiful. That is the part nobody warns you about adequately. Photographs of Datura in bloom look like something a florist would arrange for a very dramatic wedding. The flowers are large, elegant, funnel-shaped and pristine, white shading to soft purple at the edges, opening fully in the evening and releasing a scent that is, to be fair, rather lovely. This is not an accident. The plant blooms at dusk specifically to attract the hawk moths that pollinate it in the dark, long-tongued nocturnal creatures that hover over the flowers like small fuzzy helicopters. Datura is not trying to attract humans. It does not need to try. We manage that entirely on our own. The seeds are contained in a spiky green pod, the thorn apple of its common name, that dries and splits open to release hundreds of tiny dark seeds into the surrounding soil. These seeds are extraordinarily hardy, remaining viable in soil for years, which is part of why eradicating Datura from an area is such a frustrating exercise. You can pull every plant in a field and find them all back the following spring, growing cheerfully from the seed bank you didn't know was there. The plant has, in this sense, already won any argument about whether it belongs somewhere. It decides where it belongs. You are simply a bystander. Throughout history, the names humans have given it tell the whole story. Devil's trumpet, hell's bells, loco weed, mad apple, stinkweed, because up close the leaves have a strong unpleasant odour that many people describe as rank or rotten, which is the plant's one honest communication. The smell says, maybe don't. The flowers say, but look how pretty. And generation after generation, across every culture that has ever encountered this plant, a certain percentage of humans have looked at the flowers and not heard the smell. Tonight you are going to understand why that has always been such a catastrophic mistake. But first, you're going to understand exactly what you're dealing with, because Datura deserves, at the very least, the respect of being properly understood before you fall asleep next to it. Before we go further, you need to understand what you're actually dealing with on a chemical level, because the reason Datura is so terrifying is not mysterious or metaphysical. It is, in fact, extremely precise and deeply awful science. The plant contains a trio of trypane alkaloids, scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine, and these compounds do one specific thing with ruthless efficiency. They block acetylcholine receptors throughout your entire nervous system. Now, acetylcholine is the chemical that helps your brain process reality. It regulates memory, attention, perception, and the ability to distinguish between what is happening and what is not. Datura does not simply reduce this ability. It does not blur the line. It removes the line entirely, folds it up, sets it on fire, and then makes you watch the fire with someone who isn't there. Here is the thing about acetylcholine that makes its absence so catastrophic. It is not one of those neurotransmitters that handles a single specialized function in a neat corner of the brain. It is everywhere. It is in the part of your brain that processes what you see. It is in the part that filters what is real from what is imagined. It is in the part that forms new memories, which is why Datura experiences are so consistently and profoundly erased afterward. It is in the part that tells your pupils to respond to light, your mouth to produce saliva, your heart to maintain a reasonable rhythm, your bladder to function, your skin to sweat when it is hot. Datura blocks all of this simultaneously. It does not pick and choose. It walks into the entire building and turns off the lights in every room at once. The physical effects come first, and they are distinctive enough that emergency physicians can identify a Datura poisoning in seconds. The pupils dilate to extraordinary size. The clinical term is mydriasis, expanding so fully that the iris nearly disappears, and the person's eyes look black and enormous, deeply unsettling to look at. The skin becomes flushed, hot, and bone dry because the sweat glands have been shut down. The mouth dries instantly and completely. People describe trying to swallow and finding there is nothing to swallow with. The heart accelerates. The bladder stops working. The medical students remember this cluster of signs with a phrase: hot as a hair, dry as a bone, red as a beet, blind as a bat, mad as a hatter. Each of these is literal. Each of these is Datura. Then come the hallucinations, and here is where Datura separates itself from every other psychoactive substance in the world, with chilling specificity. These are not the swirling, internally known visual disturbances of other compounds, distortions you recognize as distortions, patterns that ripple across a surface you know is solid. Datura hallucinations are fully external, fully three-dimensional, indistinguishable from reality in every way. People who have taken Datura do not know they are hallucinating. They see a person sitting in a chair, and they speak to that person, and the person speaks back, and the conversation is entirely convincing right up until the moment the person simply is not there anymore. Objects appear fully formed, with weight and texture, and then dissolve when touched. Rooms fill with people. Dead relatives arrive. Impossible events occur with the full conviction of lived experience, and the person experiences all of this entirely alone, because from the outside they are simply terrified or confused or frozen or laughing at something invisible. The gap between their experience and observable reality is total. That gap is not a side effect of Datura. It is the point. Here is the thing about Datura that makes it uniquely terrifying. Even compared to other dangerous plants, there is no reliable dose. None, not even close. The concentration of alkaloids varies wildly from plant to plant, from leaf to stem to seed to flower, from one side of the garden to the other, from spring to summer to fall. A quantity that causes mild disorientation in one person will cause full multi-day psychosis in another. A dose that one plant carries in a single seed might be spread across an entire handful of seeds from a different plant. Ancient users, indigenous healers, curious teenagers, unsuspecting soldiers, all of them face the same impossible calculation. How much is too much? The answer, historically speaking, has been usually whatever amount they took. Toxicologists and pharmacologists have studied this variability extensively, and the conclusion they have reached is not reassuring. The alkaloid content of a single Datura plant can vary by a factor of 5 or more depending on environmental conditions, the soil it grew in, the amount of rainfall it received, the temperature during growth, the specific stage of the plant's development at the time it was harvested. Two plants growing side by side in the same patch of earth can have dramatically different potencies. There is no visual cue, no smell difference, no way to tell by looking at or smelling a Datura plant how much chemical firepower it is carrying. It all looks the same. The seeds all look the same. The leaves all look the same. And yet one set of leaves might cause an uncomfortable hour, and another might cause 3 days of complete psychotic delirium. The plant does not label itself. This is what makes traditional shamanic use of Datura so extraordinary, in retrospect. In cultures where it was used ceremonially, and we will come to those cultures in detail, the practitioners who administered it had typically spent years learning to read the plant, to gauge its potency by factors that are not documented in any text and may not be fully translatable into modern scientific language. They were doing something that required profound expertise, accumulated over time, passed from teacher to student, and even then, even with all of that knowledge, the outcome was never fully guaranteed. A shaman who worked with Datura was always managing uncertainty. They had simply learned to manage it better than most. For the modern person who encounters Datura casually, in a backyard, in a field, in an online forum that describes its use, none of that accumulated knowledge is available. What is available is a plant that looks identical regardless of its potency, a body that will not warn them until the alkaloids are already in their bloodstream, and a timeline of approximately 30 minutes to 2 hours before whatever is going to happen begins to happen. The only predictable thing about a Datura dose is that by the time it becomes clear whether the dose was too much, it is completely too late to do anything about it. This is also why the historical record of Datura poisonings is so consistent in its outcome. Not because the people involved were uniformly reckless. Many of them were careful, many of them were experienced, many of them thought they knew what they were doing. but because the plant simply does not cooperate with the concept of careful. It is, in this very specific and measurable sense, one of the most democratically dangerous substances on Earth. It does not care who you are, what you know, or how experienced you are. The dose is always a question. The answer is always a surprise. Long before anyone was accidentally eating Datura at a festival or reading about it on a forum, this plant had already been woven into the spiritual fabric of some of the oldest civilizations on Earth. In ancient India, Datura, known as Datura, was considered sacred to the god Shiva, left as an offering at temple shrines. Described in Sanskrit texts as far back as 2,000 years ago, Hindu ascetics called agoris were reported to use it in rituals designed to blur the boundary between life and death. In ancient China, it appeared in the early medical texts. In the Middle East, it was linked to divination practices. The common thread across every culture that encountered this plant was the same. People recognized almost immediately that this was something that stood at the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it. Whether that beyond was divine or demonic depended entirely on who was asking. The association between Datura and Shiva is particularly deep and enduring. Shiva in Hindu tradition is the god of destruction and transformation, the force that ends things so that new things can begin. He is depicted with a third eye, with serpents coiled at his throat, with ash smeared across his skin. He is the god of paradox, simultaneously the destroyer and the patron of yogis, simultaneously terrifying and compassionate. Datura, with its beauty and its violence, its capacity to destroy the ordinary mind and replace it with something unrecognizable, fits this symbolism precisely. The plant was not offered to Shiva despite its danger, it was offered because of it. The danger was the point, the danger was the devotion. In Sanskrit medical texts, Datura appears in lists of both poisons and medicines, a dual categorization that reflects a sophisticated understanding of the plant's nature. Ancient Indian physicians described its ability to cause madness, its dangers to the heart, its capacity to be used in small and carefully calibrated doses for pain relief and as a surgical preparation. They also described, in clinical terms, what an overdose looked like: the wide pupils, the dry skin, the racing pulse, the complete loss of rational thought. This is a description of anticholinergic toxicity written approximately 2,000 years before Western medicine gave it that name. In China, the plant appears in the Benko Gangmu, the great pharmacopoeia compiled by Li Shizhen in the 16th century, though its use in Chinese medicine predates this text by centuries. The Benko Gangmu describes manjanhua, the datura flower, as a treatment for pain, asthma, and various nervous conditions, with extensive warnings about its toxicity and careful instructions for preparation. It also notes, with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who has clearly seen this happen, that excessive use causes the patient to laugh and dance uncontrollably before becoming unconscious. What is striking about these ancient accounts, across cultures separated by thousands of miles and entirely independent of each other, is how consistent the description is. The same effects, the same warnings, the same dual recognition of something both powerful and profoundly dangerous. Datura has been the same plant for as long as humans have been encountering it. The chemistry has not changed. Only the context has changed. And as we will see, context turns out to matter enormously. Across the Atlantic, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had been in a long and complicated relationship with Datura for centuries before European contact. Among Aztec healers and priests, plants in the Datura family were known as toloache or telepatl, and they held a significant place in ritual medicine, divination, and ceremony. Aztec healers applied Datura preparations topically to treat pain, and in ritual contexts it was used to induce states that were considered necessary for communicating with deities. But even within cultures that revered the plant, it was handled with enormous caution, because the Aztecs were well aware that the line between a sacred vision and a fatal overdose was disturbingly thin. Healers who worked with Datura were not casual about it. They were specialists, they trained for it, and even they occasionally got it wrong. The Aztec worldview understood the cosmos as layered, multiple levels of heaven and underworld, populated by deities of tremendous power and frequently unpredictable temperament. Communication with these forces required mediation, and that mediation often involved substances that could dissolve the barrier between the ordinary and the divine. Datura sat at the extreme end of this spectrum. It was not a plant you used when you wanted a mildly heightened state. It was a plant you used when you needed to go somewhere genuinely dangerous and needed someone with serious expertise to help you get back. The Aztec medical text, known as the Badianis manuscript, compiled in 1542 and considered one of the oldest surviving herbal texts from the Americas, includes Datura among its entries with descriptions of its applications and preparations. Aztec physicians used it in poultices for pain relief, particularly for conditions affecting the joints and skin, applying it topically where its alkaloids could be absorbed in smaller quantities than ingestion would deliver. This was not unsophisticated. Topical application of anticholinergic compounds is still used in modern medicine. The physics of absorption through skin versus through the digestive system is real, and using the plant on the skin rather than eating it was a genuinely clever way to access its benefits while reducing its risks. In divination contexts, the picture is more complex and less well documented, partly because Spanish colonists systematically destroyed Aztec religious texts, and partly because the knowledge of how ritual Datura use was conducted was held by specialists who did not necessarily write it down. What survives suggests that Datura-induced states were used in the diagnosis of illness, particularly illnesses thought to have supernatural causes, and in the identification of thieves and wrongdoers. The logic was consistent with the plant's pharmacology. A person in a full anticholinergic delirium is deeply suggestible, will speak at length about things they might otherwise conceal, and will have no memory of having done so. Whether this constituted reliable diagnosis is another question, but it was consistent enough as a practice to survive across centuries. What is most important to understand about Aztec use of Datura is that it occurred within a completely elaborated cultural framework that gave it meaning, structure, and purpose. The plant was not frightening in that context because frightening was, in some sense, its function. It was supposed to take you somewhere terrifying. That was why you went. In what is now California, the Chumash people had one of the most documented relationships with Datura in the indigenous Americas. For the Chumash, a drink made from the roots of the Datura plant called mamoy was used in coming-of-age ceremonies for young men. At a certain point in adolescence, a boy would be given the drink under the supervision of tribal elders and would enter a visionary state that was intended to connect him with his spirit helper, a guiding supernatural presence that would accompany him through adulthood. The ceremony was carefully managed, heavily ritualized, and performed by experienced elders who understood the plant. It was also, by any modern measure, an extraordinarily dangerous thing to give to a teenager, and yet, within its cultural context, it was considered not an ordeal but an honor, a threshold moment, a passage into manhood, guided by something older and stranger than the ordinary world. Mamoy, the name the Chumash gave to the Datura plant, was understood as a grandmother figure, a wise and powerful ancestor spirit who lived within the plant and who would, if properly approached and properly honoured, provide guidance and protection. This is not a small semantic detail. The framing of Datura as a grandmother, as a being with intention and wisdom rather than simply as a chemical, shaped the entire relationship between the Chumash and the plant. You did not take Mamoy. You went to her, You asked, and she decided what you needed to see. Ethnobotanist Jan Timbrook, who worked extensively with Chumash oral history and material culture, documented the careful protocols that surrounded Momoy use. The root was prepared by a specialist, steeped in water to produce a drink of controlled, or as controlled as was possible, potency. The young person who was about to undergo the ceremony was prepared over days beforehand, with fasting, prayers and instruction about what to expect and how to receive what came. Elders stayed with him throughout the experience, watching, interpreting, and making sure he did not harm himself in the delirium. When the experience ended, which could take a day or more, the elders helped him interpret what he had seen, translating the images and encounters of the visionary state into guidance for his adult life. This is a strikingly sophisticated protocol for working with one of the most pharmacologically unpredictable substances on Earth. And yet, even with all of this care, accidents happened. Ethnographic records include accounts of young men who did not survive the ceremony, or who survived it with lasting damage. The Chumash didn't pretend this was not possible. Death in the Momoy ceremony was understood as a spiritual outcome. The grandmother had decided to keep the young man with her rather than return him. This interpretation may seem, from a modern medical perspective, like a way of making sense of a preventable tragedy, but it also reflects an honest acknowledgement that what was being undertaken was genuinely dangerous, and that the danger was inseparable from its power. Tonight, lying in your comfortable bed with your undisturbed neurochemistry, spare a small and sincere thought for the adolescent boys of the Chumash world who went to meet their grandmother and hoped she would send them home. If you have ever wondered where the image of a witch flying on a broomstick actually came from, you are about to receive an answer that is significantly more interesting and significantly more uncomfortable than fairy tales. By the medieval and early modern period in Europe, Datura was one of several plants, including belladonna, henbane and mandrake, that were allegedly used in preparations known as witches' flying ointments. These were salves that contained various plant-derived alkaloids and were reportedly rubbed onto the skin, or, according to some accounts, that historians have debated with equal parts rigour and discomfort, applied via mucous membranes for faster absorption. The result was vivid hallucinations of flying, of being transported to distant locations, of attending gatherings with other figures in the dark. Whether or not this actually happened, the reports were consistent enough across multiple centuries and multiple countries that historians now largely accept that something chemical was producing these experiences. Datura, it turns out, was a significant part of European folk terror for hundreds of years before anyone understood why. The historical record of flying ointments is genuinely fascinating and has been studied seriously by historians of medicine, anthropology, and the history of witchcraft. The German physician Johannes Weyer, writing in the 16th century, was one of the first to suggest that the confessions of witches, particularly their accounts of attending nocturnal sabbaths, flying through the air, and consorting with the devil, were not proof of actual supernatural activity, but were instead the product of hallucinations caused by the ointments these women were using. This was a startlingly rational position for the 16th century. Weyer was essentially proposing what we would now call a pharmacological explanation for the witch trials, and he was not entirely wrong. The alkaloids in Datura and its botanical relatives, the tropane family that includes belladonna and henbane, produce at sublethal doses exactly the kind of experience described in witchcraft confessions: flying, transformation, attendance at gatherings in distant places, encounters with powerful figures, sexual experiences, the conviction that extraordinary things have happened, and crucially, a period of deep sleep followed by patchy or absent memory of the events. A woman who rubbed a datura-containing ointment on her skin before sleeping might experience all of this, and then wake up with only fragments, which she would interpret through the cultural framework available to her. That framework in medieval Europe was witchcraft. The broomstick, according to scholars of this question, enters the picture partly as a practical tool, a handle for applying the ointment, and partly as a symbol in a tradition where flying on a stick was already an established image of female transgression. The actual mechanics of how the ointment was applied have been documented in enough historical sources with enough consistency to be taken seriously as a real practice, even if the flights themselves were entirely pharmacological. What Datura gave medieval European women in this reading was an experience of freedom and power and flight that their waking lives entirely denied them. Whether that constitutes medicine, magic, or tragedy probably depends on who you ask. The Inquisition had its answer. Modern pharmacology has a different one, and the plant has always simply kept blooming. The year is 1676, and a group of British soldiers has arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, to suppress Bacon's rebellion. They are hungry, they're tired, and someone, in a decision that would become one of the most well-documented botanical disasters in North American history, decides to boil and eat the leafy green plants growing abundantly nearby. Those plants are Datura, and what follows is the reason the plant became known as Jimson weed, a corruption of Jamestown weed. The soldiers, according to the account written by Robert Beverley in the year 1705, spent 11 days in a state of complete and total psychosis. They laughed, they wept, they made faces at each other, they picked invisible things from the air, they sat in corners, frozen, staring at nothing. They tried to kiss each other and then forgot what they were doing. They were, by any modern clinical definition, experiencing full anticholinergic delirium, and not one of them had any idea what was happening. They all survived, which, in Datura terms, makes this a good story. Robert Beverley's account, written nearly 3 decades after the event, is worth reading in its original language because it has a quality of bewildered observation that is deeply funny in retrospect and probably not funny at all to anyone who was there. He describes the soldiers as having turned themselves into the perfect fools, not as an insult but as a literal description of their behaviour. One man sat blowing a feather in the air, another sat naked in a corner like a monkey, grinning and making faces. One man would laugh, then weep, then make faces in a completely unpredictable sequence with no apparent trigger. They would walk toward each other with their arms extended and then completely forget what they had been doing before they arrived. They would pick things from the air that were not there and examine them with great seriousness, and then they would stop and stare at the wall. None of them had any memory of any of this afterward. Beverley notes that the soldiers were carefully watched throughout the 11 days, not treated because there was nothing to treat with, but simply prevented from harming themselves, which apparently required continuous supervision. They were disarmed for obvious reasons. The fact that all of them survived is genuinely remarkable and speaks either to the relatively diluted preparation they consumed, boiled, which would have partially degraded the alkaloids, or to the care of their watchers, or simply to good fortune. The episode is famous partly because it is well documented and partly because it has a built-in historical irony. A company of British soldiers sent to restore order became, via the medium of a local weed, completely incapable of order for nearly 2 weeks. They were there to stop a rebellion. The plant staged its own, and it did so without violence, without strategy, without any of the things a rebellion is supposed to require. Just flowers and leaves and a cooking pot and 11 days of men blowing feathers in the air and kissing each other. Jimson weed. The name is a tribute. The tribute is undeserved because the weed was there first, and it was not trying to commemorate anything. It was simply being what it has always been. Now let's talk about what actually happens. Not the poetry of it, not the ancient ceremony of it, but the raw, clinical, deeply unpleasant reality of what Datura does to a human body and mind in the hours after ingestion. First come the physical symptoms. The pupils dilate so widely that the eyes look almost entirely black, and the person becomes painfully sensitive to any light. The mouth dries instantly and completely. The skin becomes hot, dry, and flushed. The heart rate accelerates. The bladder stops working. Then, as the alkaloids reach full effect in the brain, the hallucinations begin. And these are not the soft, swirling, internally known hallucinations of many psychedelics. These are fully external, indistinguishable from reality, solid hallucinations. People do not know they are hallucinating. They see people sitting in chairs who are not there. They hold conversations with absent friends. They reach for objects that dissolve when touched. And then, most famously, they find themselves performing repetitive, purposeless tasks, picking lint off a floor, smoking cigarettes that don't exist, folding laundry that isn't there, over and over for hours, with total conviction. The clinical term for this pattern of repetitive, purposeless activity is perseveration, and it is one of the most distinctive features of anticholinergic delirium. A person in a full Datura state will do the same thing. Reach into their pocket, find nothing, bring their hand to their mouth, find nothing, reach into their pocket again, indefinitely, with complete concentration, without any awareness that they have performed this action dozens of times already. The action is entirely real to them. The cigarette is entirely real to them. The conversation they are having with the person who is not there is entirely real to them. Modern emergency physicians have developed a specific intake question for patients presenting with suspected anticholinergic delirium. Are they picking at things? Picking at bed sheets, picking at the air, picking at invisible objects on the floor? The answer in Datura cases is almost always yes. They are harvesting an invisible crop with absolute conviction. The timeline of a significant Datura exposure runs roughly as follows. Within 30 minutes to an hour of ingestion, the physical symptoms begin: the dry mouth, the dilated pupils, the flushing and heat. Within 1 to 2 hours, the delirium begins. The person becomes confused, agitated, and increasingly disconnected from ordinary reality. Within 3 to 4 hours at a significant dose, they are fully in the experience, hallucinating vividly, moving through a world that is entirely their own construction, completely unreachable by people around them. This state can persist for 24 hours. In some documented cases, it has persisted for 3 days or more. During this entire time, the person is not comfortable. They are not floating. They are not enjoying themselves. They are terrified, or confused, or grimly purposeful in ways that make no sense. They may strip off their clothing because they believe they are on fire. They may run because something is chasing them. They may become aggressive because someone invisible has threatened them. And through all of this, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand, they are completely alone in their experience because the world they are in is not the world anyone around them can see. This is not a trip. It is a malfunction. A beautiful, terrible, ancient malfunction. One of the most medically distinctive and, in terms of human suffering, arguably most merciful features of a Datura experience is that the person typically remembers almost none of it. Scopolamine, one of Datura's primary alkaloids, is a powerful amnesiac, so powerful that pharmaceutical versions of it have been used as a pre-surgical sedative and, in darker applications, as a so-called truth serum. When someone has taken a significant dose of Datura and spends 2 or 3 days in full psychotic delirium, wandering, screaming, sobbing, speaking to people who aren't there, they will often emerge from the experience with only fragments of memory, or none at all. They will wake up in a hospital bed, or on a forest floor, or in a stranger's backyard with no clear understanding of how they arrived or what happened. This complete amnesia is, from a medical standpoint, deeply alarming. From a historical standpoint, it explains a great deal about why so many cultures described encounters with Datura as visits to another world entirely. Scopolamine's amnesiac effect operates specifically on the formation of new memories, the process by which short-term experience is consolidated into long-term storage. What this means, in practical terms, is that the person having the experience is not simply confused at the time, and later able to reconstruct it. The memories are not being formed. The events of the delirium are not being written into memory storage as they happen, which is why they cannot be retrieved afterward. It is not that the person forgot what happened. It is that what happened was never recorded. This is clinically distinct from the amnesia of ordinary sleep or the blurry recall of a dream. Dreams are at least partially encoded. People remember fragments, images, emotions. Datura's amnesiac effect is more thorough than that. The lights are on, the person is awake, moving, speaking, acting, but the recording equipment has been switched off. Nothing is being saved. From the perspective of someone who has undergone this experience and survived it, what remains is not memories but evidence. They wake up and find evidence that something happened, bruises whose origin they do not know, messages sent from their phone that they did not write, locations they cannot account for being in, objects moved or broken or absent. They reconstruct events from the accounts of other people who are present, family members, bystanders, emergency responders, and those accounts describe a person they do not recognize performing actions they cannot imagine. This disconnect between the witnessed event and the experienced self is one of the most frequently reported features of Datura aftermath, and it is genuinely disturbing in a way that is difficult to articulate. Something happened to you. It happened thoroughly and intensely and for a significant period of time, and you were not there for any of it. The body was there. Whatever the body did, it did without you, and you will never know what it was except what someone else is willing to tell you. Sleep well with that. Or perhaps not, but you will, because the forgetting is part of the deal, and the deal once signed is not negotiable. Throughout history, the line between Datura as a sacred plant and Datura as a weapon was crossed with disturbing regularity. In ancient India, texts warn explicitly about Datura being used by criminals to incapacitate victims, a practice common enough to receive detailed legal and medical commentary. Travellers were reportedly drugged by being offered food or drink laced with Datura, rendering them helpless for robbery or worse. In China, it was reportedly used by bandits. In colonial Africa, European accounts described communities using Datura preparations against enemies. The Jamestown soldiers were an accident, but others throughout history were not so lucky. The plant's ability to incapacitate without immediately killing, combined with its utter invisibility when dissolved into food or drink and its tendency to erase the victim's memory of the event, made it a uniquely effective and deeply chilling tool for those willing to use it. In ancient Indian legal and medical texts, the poisoners who used Datura are described with specific enough detail to suggest that this was a recognized and fairly common criminal practice. They were known as Daturiyas, specialists in the art of incapacitation through the plant. Accounts describe them offering drugged sweets or drinks to travellers at roadside stalls, in markets, or even in private homes. The target would become confused and helpless within an hour and would have no memory of the encounter afterward. The Daturiya would then rob them, or abduct them, or worse, and simply walk away. The victim would wake up with nothing and no explanation. Ancient Indian courts developed specific protocols for identifying Datura poisoning precisely because it came up often enough to require them. In China, the plant's use in criminal contexts was documented in multiple dynasties. The same pattern appears, disguised in food or drink, used to render someone helpless, leaving no memory. The Ming Dynasty physician Li Shizhen noted in the 16th century that criminals used Datura-laced wine to incapacitate victims for robbery. He described the experience that followed, the madness, the helplessness, the subsequent forgetting, with clinical precision and what reads, between the lines, as genuine unease. In the colonial Americas, Spanish accounts describe Datura being added to the communal drink known as chicha as a means of covert poisoning, both in interpersonal conflicts and in what might be called guerrilla warfare against colonizers. The accounts are not always reliable. Colonial documents often described indigenous practices with considerable distortion, but the consistent pattern of Datura use as a covert incapacitant across multiple, unrelated cultures suggests something real. The plant works, people knew it worked, and some people throughout history decided that knowing it worked was all the permission they needed. There is a particular horror to this use of Datura that is distinct from its accidental ingestion, or even its shamanic use. In those contexts, the person who takes the plant has some degree of choice, some degree of framework, some degree of expectation. In the poisoning context, the person has none of these. They eat their meal, they drink their drink, they go about their evening, and then the world simply dissolves, and they are alone in it, and they do not know why, and afterward they do not even have the memory to tell them what happened. The plant, in this application, is not a gateway to another world. It is a tool for making a person temporarily cease to exist, not dead, not sleeping, but somewhere so far from themselves that they cannot be reached. It is, by any definition, a profound violation, and it worked with such consistency that it was used, documented, warned against, and used again across thousands of years and on every inhabited continent. In certain parts of West Africa, and among some indigenous communities in the Americas, Datura and closely related plants played a role not just in individual spiritual practice, but in initiation into secret societies, brotherhoods and sisterhoods, whose rites of passage involved deliberately induced states of derangement, visions, and symbolic death and rebirth. The logic of these initiations follows a pattern familiar across cultures. To become a full member of the community, you had to experience something that dissolved the ordinary self completely, something that took you to the edge of what the mind can survive and brought you back. Datura, with its complete erasure of ordinary reality and its profound amnesia, was ideally suited to this symbolic function. You went in as one person. You came back, if you came back, as someone else. What happened in between existed only in the visions which you could not remember, and in the faces of the elders who had watched over you, which told you everything had gone according to plan. The Poor Society in West Africa, a male initiation organization active across several countries including Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Côte d'Ivoire, involved initiation rites that were by design intended to be terrifying and transformative. While Datura was not the only element, plants with anticholinergic properties appear in ethnobotanical accounts of the preparations given to initiates entering their period of seclusion. The initiate was understood to have died during the seclusion period and to be reborn when he emerged. If he remembered nothing of what happened during that period, this was not a failure. This was correct. The self that went in was not supposed to survive intact. That was the point. This concept, that the complete dissolution of ordinary consciousness is not a side effect of initiation, but its actual mechanism, is one of the most consistent themes in the anthropology of initiation rituals. The body needs to not know what happened. The ordinary mind needs to have been taken somewhere it cannot report back from. Because what is being created in the initiate is not a new set of memories, but a new kind of person, and a new kind of person cannot be made from the same continuous thread of memory and self that the old person was made of. You cannot become someone else while still being yourself. Something has to break, and the forgetting is the breaking. Seen through this lens, Datura's pharmacology is not incidental to its ceremonial use. It is the ceremonial use. The amnesia is not a complication, it is the point. The plant was chosen across multiple cultures independently because it could do the one thing no other experience quite could. It could make you go somewhere so completely that you could not bring it back. And then you were new. Whether this worked in the sense that modern psychology would recognize is a different question, but it worked in the sense that communities believed it did, conducted it for generations, and produced individuals who understood themselves to have undergone something genuinely transformative. The plant was not merely symbolic, the plant was the mechanism, and somewhere in the darkness of an initiation ground, an elder was watching a young man have the worst night of his life, and knowing, with the calm certainty of someone who had been through it and had been watching it for decades, that this was going exactly as it was supposed to. In many of the cultures that used Datura most extensively, the plant was not simply given to anyone who asked. It was the domain of the shaman, the healer, the spiritual specialist, the person whose job it was to cross into the unseen world on behalf of the community and return with information, healing, or guidance. Shamanic use of Datura across indigenous cultures in the Americas, Asia, and parts of Africa followed a consistent pattern. Careful preparation, ritual context, experience supervision, and a community framework that made sense of the experience before, during, and after it occurred. The shaman was not simply getting high. The shaman was doing a job, a dangerous, skilled, highly specialized job that required years of training and carried real physical risk. And yet within that framework, the plant produced experiences that were considered not frightening but necessary, not psychotic but revelatory. The difference, scholars have argued, may lie less in the pharmacology than in the meaning. Mircea Eliade, the Romanian scholar whose work on shamanism remains foundational, described the shaman as a technician of the sacred, someone who had developed, through years of training and experience, the ability to navigate altered states of consciousness purposefully rather than being simply overwhelmed by them. This is a useful frame for understanding Datura shamanism. The plant does not change its chemistry for an experienced shaman. The alkaloids are the same, the pharmacological effects are the same. What is different is the container, the elaborate system of preparation, intention, ritual, and community support that surrounds the experience and gives it meaning and structure. A Datura shaman who was undertaking a healing session on behalf of a sick community member was not entering the experience blind or alone. They had done this before, possibly many times. They had been trained by a predecessor who had done it many more times. They had a specific question they were seeking an answer to, a specific task they were attempting to perform in the unseen world. They had community, members present who were praying, singing, maintaining a fire, and watching over their physical body while their consciousness was elsewhere. They had a set of symbols, narratives, and frameworks within which to interpret whatever they encountered. And when they returned, when the delirium resolved and the ordinary world reassembled itself around them, they had colleagues and community to help them translate the experience into something communicable and useful. This is extraordinarily different from a person alone in a room who has eaten a plant they found in their backyard and has no framework for what is happening. The pharmacology is the same. The outcome is not even close. What shamanic traditions discovered, through centuries of working with Datura and similar plants, is something that modern consciousness researchers are only beginning to articulate in scientific terms. That set and setting, the mental state and physical environment in which a powerful psychoactive experience occurs, shapes that experience as much as the chemistry does. The shaman's elaborate protocols were not superstition. They were hard-won practical knowledge about how to keep a dangerous tool from destroying the person wielding it. They were the manual that the plant itself refuses to provide. Across multiple cultures, Datura appears not only in rituals of birth and initiation, but in rituals surrounding death, and not simply as a metaphor. In some traditions, Datura was used to ease the dying, to facilitate visions at the threshold of death, or to allow the living to communicate with the recently deceased. In others, it was rubbed onto the body of the dead before burial. In still others, it was consumed by mourners as part of a grief ritual designed to allow direct experience of the place where the dead now resided. This association between Datura and death is so consistent across cultures that ethnobotanists have noted it as one of the plant's most universal symbolic roles, and given what the plant actually does to human consciousness, erasing ordinary reality, producing encounters with presences that aren't there, dissolving the boundary between self and world, it is not difficult to understand why. Datura does not feel like life. It feels like wherever life goes afterward. Among certain indigenous groups in the American Southwest, ethnobotanical accounts describe Datura being used in mourning rituals, where close relatives of the deceased would take the plant to encounter the spirit of the person who had died and receive guidance or closure from them. The hallucinations Datura produces are so fully real to the person experiencing them. The figures that appear are so three-dimensional, so solid, so apparently present, that a person who saw their dead parent in a Datura state would not have experienced a dream or an imagination. They would have had a conversation. They would have received information. Whether that information came from the plant's pharmacology or from something beyond it is a question that modern science and traditional cosmology will probably never agree on. But the experience was real, and the comfort it provided was real, and the communities that used it this way were not being primitive. They were being pragmatic about grief. In parts of South America, Datura and its close relative Brugmansia, a larger tree-like version sometimes called angel's trumpet, were used in burial contexts for high-status individuals. Accounts from Spanish colonial records describe servants or wives of important men being given Datura preparations before being buried alive alongside their masters, a practice that horrified the Spanish and has been documented archaeologically at several sites. The Datura in this context served as both sedative and symbolic preparation. The person would enter the burial in a state of delirium, their ordinary consciousness already dissolved, already somewhere between the living and the dead, making the transition easier to accomplish and, one hopes, less terrifying to undergo. This is an application of Datura that sits at the edge of everything we might want to think about it. Not healing, not initiation, not accidental disaster, but a ritual use that is simultaneously pharmacologically sophisticated and deeply disturbing. The plant was understood well enough to be used for this specific purpose. That is a measure of how long and how carefully some communities had been observing it. The moral framework around that use is a separate conversation. But the knowledge behind it is real, and it is ancient, and it deserves to be named clearly. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas in the 16th century, they encountered Datura almost immediately, both as a plant and as a practice. The ritual use of Datura among indigenous peoples horrified and fascinated them in roughly equal measure. Spanish priests and colonial authorities wrote extensively about what they called the devil's herb, describing its effects in terms that mixed genuine medical observation with theological alarm. The plant was denounced as an instrument of sorcery, its use condemned, its cultivation targeted as part of the broader colonial suppression of indigenous spiritual practice. And yet, with a particular irony that history seems to specialize in, the Spanish also noted the plant's medical potential, particularly atropine's ability to dilate the pupil, which would eventually lead to Datura's alkaloids becoming the foundation of several legitimate pharmaceutical drugs still in use today. The Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, who compiled the extraordinary Florentine Codex in the 16th century, one of the most detailed ethnographic records of Aztec culture ever produced, included Datura in his extensive catalogue of plants used by Aztec healers and priests. Sahagún's account is careful and observational, clearly based on information provided by Aztec informants, and it describes both the medicinal applications and the hallucinogenic effects of tlapatl, with a specificity that suggests first-hand accounts were being recorded rather than simply assumed. He notes that eating the plant causes madness, visions, and loss of rational thought. He notes that it was used by priests for divination. He notes that it was dangerous. His tone is that of a man writing down something important, because it needs to be documented, even if what is being documented disturbs him. Other Spanish observers were less measured. The Inquisition's records from colonial Mexico contain numerous trials in which indigenous and mestizo practitioners were accused of using datura in practices that were characterized as devil worship. The plant's ability to produce experiences that were, from the outside, indistinguishable from possession or madness made it an obvious target for this kind of charge. A person in a full datura delirium, viewed through the theological framework of 16th century Spanish. Catholicism looked exactly like what the Inquisition said they looked like, someone whose soul had been taken. The diagnosis was wrong, the observation was accurate. The Colonial project systematically destroyed the knowledge systems within which datura use made sense, the specialists who knew how to use it, the rituals that provided context, the training systems that produced healers who could work with it safely. What was left in many cases was the plant without the framework, accessible to anyone, stripped of the protocols that had made its use survivable. This is arguably one of the lasting harms of colonialism that rarely gets discussed in these terms. The destruction of the harm reduction knowledge that surrounded dangerous traditional medicines, leaving the danger without the reduction. The plant outlasted the people who knew how to manage it, and that in retrospect is a kind of tragedy that compounds quietly across centuries, in what may be the most unexpected paragraph. In this entire script, datura has also, throughout history, been used as medicine, real medicine that actually worked, carefully and dangerously applied by practitioners who understood at least some of what they were doing. For centuries in Europe and Asia, datura-based preparations were used to treat asthma. Stramonium cigarettes, actual cigarettes made from dried datura leaves, were prescribed by doctors and sold in pharmacies well into the 20th century for people with respiratory conditions, because the alkaloids act as bronchodilators and genuinely open the airways. Atropine, derived from plants in the same family, became one of the most important drugs in modern medicine, used in eye surgery, cardiac emergencies, and as an antidote to nerve agents. Scopolamine is still used today in patches to treat motion sickness and as a surgical sedative. Datura, in controlled, purified, pharmaceutical doses, is not a monster. It is the source of genuine medical tools. The monster is the plant itself, where the dose is always a question and the answer is always a surprise. Asthma cigarettes containing stramonium, the species of datura found throughout Europe and North America, were a mainstream medical product for a remarkably long time. They were sold under brand names, prescribed by physicians, and recommended in medical textbooks well into the mid-20th century. The logic was sound. The alkaloids in datura genuinely relax bronchial smooth muscle, opening the airways and providing real relief from the constriction of an asthma attack. Patients who used them reported genuine benefit. The problem, as with everything involving this plant, was the dose, because a cigarette made from crushed datura leaves contained an unpredictable quantity of alkaloids, and the difference between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose was narrow enough to be alarming. reports of patients experiencing hallucinations, confusion, and acute delirium from their prescribed asthma treatment were common enough to be noted in the medical literature. They were treated as side effects rather than as the nearly inevitable consequence of inhaling an unpurified plant with variable alkaloid content. The cigarettes persisted for a long time before better bronchodilators replaced them. Atropine, the purified alkaloid derived from Datura's botanical relatives, is a different story, one of pharmacy's genuine success stories, a dangerous compound tamed by isolation and precise dosing. Ophthalmologists have used atropine to dilate pupils for examination since the 19th century. Anesthesiologists use it to prevent dangerous drops in heart rate during surgery. Emergency physicians use it to treat certain cardiac arrhythmias. Military medics carry it as an antidote to organophosphate nerve agents, which kill by causing the exact opposite of Datura's effect, a flood of acetylcholine rather than a blockade of it. In this context, atropine's ability to block acetylcholine receptors is precisely what saves lives. The mechanism that makes Datura so terrifying in uncontrolled doses is, in the right context, a life-saving tool. This is pharmacology's oldest lesson. The dose makes the poison. Or, in Datura's case, the poison makes the medicine. As European medicine and botany grew more systematic in the 18th and 19th centuries, Datura became the subject of increasingly serious scientific attention and increasingly well-documented disasters. Accidental poisonings were reported regularly, children who ate the seeds, adults who mistook the leaves for other plants, herbalists who miscalculated doses, and in at least a handful of cases, patients who were prescribed Datura-based treatments and received too much. These incidents produced detailed medical accounts that read, in retrospect, as almost exactly identical to modern reports of anticholinergic toxicity. The same wide pupils, the same dry skin, the same racing pulse, the same profound and terrifying delirium, the same complete amnesia upon recovery. Scientists of the era were both horrified by the plant's danger and deeply intrigued by its properties, and it was during this period that the active alkaloids were first isolated, named, and studied, the beginning of the pharmacological understanding that eventually turned a terrifying weed into a medical tool. The Scottish physician William Cullen, writing in the late 18th century, described stramonium with the careful ambivalence of a man who had seen both its benefits and its disasters. He documented its use in the treatment of epilepsy, mania, and various neurological conditions, while noting that the margin between therapeutic effect and toxic effect was distressingly thin. His students who tried to use it therapeutically frequently found themselves managing accidental poisonings alongside the conditions they were attempting to treat. The plant, in this period, was less a medicine than a pharmacological dare, something that clearly did things, powerful things, but that consistently refused to do exactly the things you wanted it to do, and only those things. The 19th century brought the first serious attempts to isolate and understand the active compounds. German chemists isolated atropine in 1831, scopolamine in 1880. These isolations were significant not only because they produced purified compounds that could be dosed precisely, but because they fundamentally changed the relationship between medical science and the plant. Before isolation, using Datura medically meant using the whole plant with all its variability. After isolation, the active compounds could be weighed, standardized, and administered in known quantities. The plant itself became, in some sense, obsolete, a crude natural source from which useful molecules could be extracted and refined. But the plant is still there, in the fields and roadsides and backyard gardens, unchanged, carrying its unpurified mixture of alkaloids in variable and unknowable quantities. All the science in the world has not changed what it does. it has only taught us, at considerable human cost, why. Writers, poets, and intellectuals throughout history encountered Datura, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not, and the accounts they left behind form one of the most consistent and deeply unsettling bodies of experiential writing in the history of psychoactive plants. Unlike substances that produce experiences the mind can organize and later describe with some coherence, Datura is almost universally described as beyond language, not because the experience is too beautiful, but because it was too total, too disorienting, too close to actual madness to be reliably narrated. Accounts speak of complete conviction in impossible things, of conversations with the dead, of hours or days that passed as seconds, or seconds that stretched into what felt like years, of waking up in places with no memory of how one arrived. The literary record of Datura is not a record of wonder. It is a record of the edge of the self and what it looks like from the other side. The 19th century American physician Silas Weir Mitchell, famous for his work on nerve injuries sustained in the Civil War, experimented with mescaline and wrote a celebrated account of that experience. But Mitchell also knew Datura, and his notes on it, less celebrated, far less lyrical, describe it in terms that stand in stark contrast to his mescaline writing. Where mescaline produced beautiful visions he could describe with pleasure, Datura produced a state he struggled to characterize at all, partly because what he remembered of it was fragmentary, and partly because what he did remember was not the kind of thing a Victorian gentleman physician published comfortably. The explorer and naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, travelling in South America in the early 19th century, documented the use of brugmansia, Datura's tree form, relative by indigenous communities, and described observing its effects on individuals who had been given it. His account is restrained but clear. The person became utterly unreachable, entirely absent from the shared world, moving through experiences that were invisible to everyone around them and completely real to themselves. Von Humboldt was not a man easily alarmed. His account of Datura is alarmed. In the 20th century, the writer William S. Burroughs described a deliberate Datura experiment with characteristic flatness. It was, he said, the most disagreeable thing he had ever taken, and he had taken an extraordinary range of things. He described feeling that he had lost his mind rather than expanded it, that there was no pleasure, no beauty, no insight, only an extended period of not knowing where he was or who he was, followed by waking up somewhere he did not recognize. Burroughs was not a man who frightened easily, and the fact that Datura frightened him is more eloquent than any description of the experience itself could be. The literature of Datura does not produce converts. It produces witnesses. People who went somewhere none of them wanted to go and came back with an account that consistently agrees on one thing: do not do this. In the 1960s and 70s, as the counterculture swept across the United States and Western Europe with an enthusiastic interest in consciousness expansion, Datura inevitably made its way into the conversation. Books like Carlos Castaneda's accounts of shamanic practice, which described encounters with plants of power in the Sonoran Desert, introduced a generation of readers to the idea of Datura as a gateway to mystical experience. The results, for those who tried it recreationally based on this framing, were almost uniformly catastrophic. Emergency rooms saw a surge of young people presenting with complete delirium, terrified family members in tow having taken a plant they found growing by a highway because someone told them it was spiritual. Poison control centers developed specialized protocols. Psychiatrists wrote case reports. The experiences described by survivors did not sound like enlightenment. They sounded like being placed, without consent, inside someone else's nightmare and told that this was you. Castaneda's books, beginning with the Teachings of Don Juan in 1968, described his apprenticeship to a Yaqui Indian sorcerer who used a preparation he called devil's weed, which Castaneda identified as Datura, as one of 4 plants of power central to the teaching. The accounts of Datura used in these books are vivid, dramatic, and deeply appealing to the psychedelic curious reader of the 1960s. Flying, transformation, encounters with powerful spirits, the dissolution of ordinary limitations. The books were enormously popular. They were also, scholarly consensus now holds, largely fictional, or at best heavily embellished. The Datura episodes in particular are written with a specificity and coherence that do not match the amnesiac, disorienting reality of what Datura actually does. No one who has had a real Datura experience describes it the way Castaneda does. They describe it the way emergency room nurses do. The Counterculture's encounter with Datura was, in retrospect, a predictable collision between a romantic idea of consciousness expansion and a plant that has absolutely no interest in being romantic. Psilocybin offers beautiful visions and philosophical insights. LSD produces cascading synesthetic experiences with generally positive emotional valence. Datura produces 3 days of believing that something unspeakable is happening to you in a world that does not correspond to any world anyone else can see. The Venn diagram of people who wanted the former and accidentally got the latter in the late 1960s was larger than it should have been, and the emergency room records of that era are accordingly grim. What the Counterculture encounter with Datura ultimately produced, besides a lot of hospitalized young people, was a gradual and hard-won consensus within the psychedelic community itself. This one is different. This one is not in the category of substances that expand consciousness. This one is the category of substances that temporarily destroys it. That consensus, slow and costly as it was to arrive at, has probably saved a significant number of lives in the decades since. The word got around. Datura acquired a reputation. It deserved it. With the arrival of the internet, Datura entered a new and particularly concerning phase of its relationship with human curiosity. Forums, websites, and eventually social media created spaces where people shared their experiences with the plant, warned others away from it, and, with the particular perversity of human nature, sometimes seemed to make it more appealing by making it sound truly extreme. Trip reports from Datura are unlike those for almost any other substance. They're almost universally negative, frequently terrifying, often written by people who sound as if they are still not entirely sure what happened to them. And yet, with full access to this information, people continue to try it. Not in spite of the warnings, but sometimes, it seems, because of them. Datura became a kind of forbidden internet challenge, its reputation for horror, both a warning and, for a specific type of person, at a specific age, an invitation. Poison Control Centers today list Datura as one of the most consistently dangerous plant-based substances they encounter. The psychonaut communities of the early internet, forums dedicated to the careful documentation of psychoactive substance experiences, treated Datura with a distinctive wariness that is largely absent from their discussions of other substances. On platforms where users rate their experiences with various compounds on scales from pleasant to challenging, Datura consistently occupies a category of its own. Not challenging, not unpleasant, but genuinely dangerous and actively unrecommended. Experienced users who had tried a wide range of substances would describe Datura encounters not as the worst trip they had ever had, but as something categorically different from a trip, something that belonged in a different conversation entirely. The trip reports themselves became a genre. They share a distinctive structure, a decision that seemed at the time reasonable, or at least not obviously catastrophic. A period of time that is mostly blank, a recovery that involves reconstruction from external evidence, and an aftermath characterized by a specific quality of unease that is difficult to name. The writers of these reports are almost universally extremely eager to communicate one thing: this was not worth it. Do not do this. I am telling you this because I was not told this, or was told this and did not listen, and I need you to understand what that cost me. The internet has given Datura a larger audience than it has ever had before. It has also, somewhat counterintuitively, probably been more effective at communicating its genuine danger than any warning system that preceded it. The first-person accounts are too consistent to dismiss, too specific to disbelieve. They have the quality of honest reporting because there is nothing to gain from making a Datura experience sound worse than it was. It sounds like what it was, and what it was enough. For emergency medicine physicians and toxicologists, a Datura poisoning is a recognizable and deeply alarming presentation. The patient arrives, or is brought, in a state that looks, on initial assessment, like profound psychiatric emergency, agitated, shouting at invisible figures, picking at the air, unable to communicate coherently, deeply confused about where they are or who is around them. Vital signs tell a different story. Pupils blown wide, skin burning hot and dry, heart racing. This constellation of signs, the clinical phrase is anticholinergic toxidrome, immediately flags the cause. Treatment involves activated charcoal if the ingestion was recent, careful monitoring of cardiac rhythm, IV fluids, and in severe cases, a drug called psilocybin that temporarily restores acetylcholine function and can pull a patient back from the deepest depths of the delirium. But there is no truly reversing a full Datura poisoning. There is only waiting, watching, and hoping the body processes what it has been given before something irreversible happens. The triage experience with a Datura patient is, by the accounts of emergency nurses, extraordinarily difficult in ways that go beyond the clinical. The patient is not unconscious, which would be easier to manage. They are fully awake, fully mobile, and fully convinced that things are happening that are not happening. They may resist treatment because the nurses approaching them are not nurses in their experience, they are figures in whatever scene the delirium has constructed. They may attempt to leave because they need urgently to get somewhere that does not exist. They may be calm and then become suddenly agitated in response to something invisible. The experience of caring for a Datura patient requires restraining a person who is not choosing to be difficult, but who is simply in a different world than everyone else in the room, responding rationally to a reality that no one else can perceive. Psilocybin, the antidote used in severe cases, is itself not without risk. It inhibits the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, effectively flooding the system with the neurotransmitter that Datura has been blocking. When it works, the effect can be dramatic. A patient who has been completely unreachable becomes within minutes lucid, oriented, and bewildered by where they are and how they got there. The delirium does not taper. It does not gradually resolve. It ends more or less at once, like a screen going dark. The patient looks around. They see the hospital room. They have no idea how they arrived. And then, sometimes the psilocybin wears off before the Datura does, and the whole thing begins again. The cardiac effects of Datura are among the most dangerous. Atropine in high doses causes tachycardia, a racing heart that can in serious cases progress to dangerous arrhythmias. The hypothermia, the dangerous elevation of body temperature caused by the shutdown of sweating, is also a genuine threat, particularly in warm weather or in an environment where the person has been active during their delirium. Cases of Datura-related death are not common, but they are not rare either, and they tend to involve one or more of these complications: an arrhythmia that went undetected, a fall sustained during the delirium, a body temperature that climbed high enough to cause organ damage before anyone found the person. Emergency medicine has become quite good at managing anticholinergic toxidrome, but it has to find the patient first. And patients in Datura delirium are not always easy to find. In a detail that manages to be both scientifically interesting and quietly humbling, most animals avoid Datura instinctively. Cattle, horses, sheep, and other grazing animals will typically walk past Datura without eating it, a behaviour attributed to the plant's strong, unpleasant smell and bitter taste, which function as natural deterrents. Reports of livestock poisoning from Datura are almost always accidental, occurring when the plant is inadvertently dried into hay, or otherwise mixed with feed in a way that obscures its identity. The instinct apparently is to leave it alone. This instinct, unfortunately, is one that some members of the human species have historically found very difficult to act upon, which says something about either the remarkable curiosity of the human mind or its remarkable ability to override the perfectly sensible signals of the human body. The plant smells like a warning. Most animals hear that warning. A small but historically significant number of humans have responded to it by reaching for a cooking pot. The chemistry behind animals' avoidance of Datura is reasonably well understood. The alkaloids themselves are bitter. Evolved bitterness is a plant's way of communicating that it is not food, a signal that most herbivores have learned, over millions of years of evolutionary history, to respect. The smell of Datura's leaves is also genuinely unpleasant at close range, a sharp, rank odour that most animals recognise as a deterrent. These signals are not subtle. They are the plant being as clear as a plant can be about what it contains and what will happen if it is eaten. Horses are particularly sensitive to Datura, and will generally refuse to eat it even when other forage is scarce. This is significant because horses in desperate enough conditions will eat many things they normally avoid, which makes Datura's consistent refusal by horses a fairly strong indicator that the deterrent signals are genuinely effective. Goats, those famously indiscriminate eaters who will consume almost anything placed in front of them, also largely avoid Datura when given the choice, which tells you something quite specific about where Datura sits on the palatability scale. When livestock poisonings do occur, they are almost always the result of Datura being mixed into feed inadvertently, dried with hay, included in stored grain, or present in silage where the smell and taste are masked by fermentation. The symptoms in affected animals are the same as in humans: dilated pupils, rapid heart rate, dry mucous membranes, muscle weakness, and, in severe cases, death. Veterinary treatment of anticholinergic toxidrome in livestock follows similar principles to human treatment: supportive care, temperature management, close monitoring of cardiac function. The quiet moral of all of this is sitting right there in the field. The cow walks around. Datura. The horse turns away. The goat, that legendary consumer of everything, takes a sniff and moves on. And somewhere in human evolutionary history, a divergence occurred between the sensory warning systems that other animals reliably act on and the human cognitive capacity to override those systems with curiosity, ritual, hunger, or the simple and apparently irresistible desire to find out what happens if you eat the thing you are not supposed to eat. It is, in a sense, one of the oldest human stories, and Datura is one of its most consistent characters. Part of what makes Datura so historically ubiquitous is that it has not needed to be spread deliberately across the world. It has spread itself, colonizing disturbed soils wherever humans have created them, and arriving wherever human movement has taken it. A botanical hitchhiker with extraordinary ambitions. Today, the genus Datura includes multiple species distributed across every inhabited continent, each with its own regional names, its own local history, and its own specific alkaloid profile. In Mexico it is toloache, used in folk magic and love potions. In South Africa it is malpita, and its seeds are soaked in beer and occasionally consumed with, shall we say, mixed results. In India, it remains Datura, still left as an offering to Shiva in certain temples, and still occasionally responsible for hospitalizations. In Australia, introduced species have established themselves in agricultural areas, worrying livestock farmers. The plant is not one story. It is hundreds of stories, playing out simultaneously across the planet, with remarkable consistency in how they end. In South Africa, Malpite, which translates loosely as mad seeds, has a long history of use in traditional healing contexts and an equally long history of accidental and intentional poisoning. The seeds are particularly potent in the South African species, and traditional preparations involving them require knowledge that has not always been accurately transmitted between generations or across cultural boundaries. Reports of hospitalization following Malpite ingestion appear with reliable regularity in South African medical literature, typically involving young people who have encountered the plant without adequate understanding of its effects. The name is, in this sense, self-explanatory. The seeds are called mad seeds. They are called this because that is what they produce. The naming tradition has been remarkably honest. In Mexico, toloch occupies a specific cultural niche as a component of love magic, a plant reputed to make the person who consumes it fall in love with whoever administered it, or at least become completely compliant and devoid of normal judgment. The pharmacological basis for this reputation is straightforwardly the scopolamine-induced suggestibility and amnesia that we have already established. Whether toloch actually makes anyone fall in love is questionable. Whether it makes people highly suggestible and completely amnesiac about the experience is not questionable at all. The love potion reputation has made toloch a persistent feature of Mexican folk magic, and, less charitably, a tool that has been used by people with intentions far less romantic than the tradition implies. In Europe, where the plant arrived and established itself early in the history of the continent, the regional names track through the history of fear. Devil's apple in England, stinkweed in Germany, crazy herb in Eastern Europe. Every name is a warning wearing a costume. Every name knows what it is talking about. The plant arrives somewhere new. The local population encounters it. Someone has a terrible experience. And a name is born. The name endures. The plant endures alongside it. In the folk magic traditions of numerous cultures, from Mexican curanderismo to European herbalism to certain African diasporic traditions, Datura has been associated with love spells, enchantment, and the inducement of compliance in a target. The folkloric logic is straightforward, if deeply troubling. Datura causes confusion and suggestibility, makes the affected person highly responsive to suggestion, and erases memory. In folk magic, this was interpreted as a kind of supernatural power over the will. In modern terms, it is a description of drugging someone without consent, which is why Datura-based preparations have appeared, historically and occasionally in the present day, in cases of intentional poisoning in intimate partner contexts. The line between love magic and assault was never in these traditions as firm as it should have been, and the plant, indifferent to intentions, produced the same effects regardless of why it had been given. The cultural logic of love magic has always involved some form of overriding another person's will, making them feel something they would not otherwise feel, binding them to a desire or a person they might otherwise have left behind. This logic is, from one angle, a fantasy about connection and belonging. From another angle, it is a framework that normalizes removing another person's capacity for autonomous choice. Datura sits in this tradition not accidentally, but specifically, because its pharmacological effects map directly onto what folk magic traditions imagined a love potion should do. Confusion, compliance, amnesia, the inability to form new intentions. Whatever the person did before they drank the preparation, After it, they were different, more open, less resistant, and afterward they did not remember having been either. Historical accounts of toloch being used in relationships are numerous enough in Mexican folk medicine literature to constitute a documented practice. They range from sympathetic, a person desperate to hold on to someone they were losing, resorting to what their tradition offered, to deeply troubling, involving clear descriptions of incapacitating another person without their knowledge. The people who used it in these contexts were not operating within the framework of a healing specialist managing a ritual use of a dangerous plant. They were using a powerful anticholinergic compound in the food or drink of another person, without that person's awareness or consent. The folk magic framing does not change the pharmacology. It does not change the absence of consent. It provides only a cultural vocabulary for what is, regardless of that vocabulary, a poisoning. This is one of Datura's most persistent dark uses, not spectacular, not ancient, not ritualized, but quiet and intimate, and occurring in ordinary domestic settings across multiple cultures and centuries. The plant that ancient priests used to communicate with the divine was also used by ordinary people to make their partners stay. The gap between those two applications is enormous. The plant is the same in both of them. In the deserts and dry plains of the American Southwest, jimsonweed grows with an almost theatrical abundance. Tall, dramatic, pungent, its white trumpets opening at dusk to attract the moths that pollinate it in the dark. For the indigenous peoples of this region, including the Zuni, the Navajo, and various Puebloan groups, Datura held significant ceremonial and medical roles, often administered by specialized practitioners in carefully controlled ritual contexts. The Zuni reportedly used it to induce sleep during the setting of broken bones. The Navajo used it in healing ceremonies. Ethnobotanists in the 19th and early 20th centuries documented these uses with varying degrees of accuracy and sensitivity, and the overall picture that emerges is of communities that held the plant in deep respect, not because it was friendly, but precisely because it was not. In the American Southwest, Datura is still there, still blooming every evening, still waiting. It has not changed. It does not change. That is, in its own way, part of what makes it so extraordinary. The Zuni use of Datura as an analgesic during bone setting and surgery is one of the most frequently cited examples of indigenous pharmacological knowledge in the ethnobotanical literature, and it is genuinely sophisticated. The problem with setting a broken bone is that the patient understandably does not want to lie still while you do it. Sedating them with a compound that also provides pain relief and amnesia, so they will not remember the procedure, is a very reasonable medical goal. Datura, in carefully managed doses administered by a specialist with experience in its use, achieves all three. The specialist who administered the Datura was not improvising. They were practicing a skill that had been developed and transmitted across generations and that represented accumulated knowledge of how much, in what form, administered how, to achieve a specific medical outcome without killing the patient. The Navajo relationship with Datura is documented in the ceremonial context of healing sings, complex ceremonies, performed by trained healers to restore the balance understood to underlie health. Datura appears in specific ceremonies as one of several powerful medicines, handled by the singer with considerable care and used in amounts and forms that were not improvised but specified. The knowledge of how to work with Datura in these contexts was part of a body of specialized training that required years to acquire and that was not simply available to anyone who wanted it. Today, jimsonweed grows freely across the American Southwest, in fields and roadsides and the edges of hiking trails. It blooms reliably every summer evening. It is beautiful in the way that the desert is beautiful, stark and dramatic, and completely indifferent to whether you appreciate it. Hikers encounter it. Children encounter it. People photograph it. Occasionally someone eats it, and the emergency rooms of Tucson and Albuquerque and El Paso have a quiet understanding of what comes next. The plant is ancient. The knowledge of how to manage it in many cases is not. What the Zuni and the Navajo knew about working with it safely is documented imperfectly in ethnobotanical records. But the living tradition of that knowledge, in many communities, did not survive colonialism intact. And so the plant and the danger persist, and the expertise that once made it manageable is partly absent, and the desert blooms every night as if none of this matters, because to the desert it doesn't. For the people who survive a significant Datura encounter, and the majority do survive, though not without cost, the aftermath can extend far beyond the hours or days of acute delirium. In the days following a major anticholinergic poisoning, patients frequently experience profound fatigue, cognitive fog, anxiety, and sensitivity to light and sound that can persist for a week or more. Some report that the fragments of hallucination that do make it through the amnesia are deeply disturbing, half memories of things seen that feel, in their vivid particularity, more real than ordinary memory. There are case reports of individuals experiencing flashback-like intrusions in the weeks following a Datura poisoning, not in the way associated with other psychedelics, but more like the sudden, unbidden surfacing of a conviction that something impossible is true. Recovery in most cases is full, but full recovery takes time, and time during a Datura poisoning works in ways that the human brain was not designed to experience. The cognitive fog that follows a significant anticholinergic poisoning is well documented in the medical literature and is not simply a matter of feeling tired or hungover. The brain's acetylcholine systems are involved in memory formation, attention, and the kind of moment-to-moment cognitive processing that makes it possible to follow a conversation or remember what you were doing 3 minutes ago. When those systems have been globally disrupted for an extended period, the recovery is not instantaneous. People who have survived significant Datura exposures describe in the days and weeks that follow a quality of mental slowness, difficulty concentrating, difficulty forming new memories, a sense that their thoughts are arriving from slightly further away than usual. This is not psychological distress, though that is also often present. It is a physiological recovery from a profound neurological insult. Think of it this way. Your brain, ordinarily, is running a very efficient piece of software, one that has been refined over millions of years of evolutionary history to process reality smoothly, quickly, and without visible effort. Datura does not crash that software. It does something arguably worse. It runs the entire system at full power with none of the usual inputs. The machinery keeps moving. The outputs are completely disconnected from reality. And when the drug finally clears and reality reconnects, there is a recalibration period, a period during which the system is running again but not yet running well, like a computer that has just recovered from a power failure and is still rebuilding its indexes. During this period, tasks that were previously automatic feel effortful. Things that were previously easy feel distant. The world is technically back, but it does not feel entirely solid yet. The fragments of memory that do survive the amnesia are often the most disturbing part of the aftermath. The amnesia is not total in every case, and the pieces that get through are not selected for being gentle. They are fragments of the most vivid moments, the most alarming hallucinations, the most convincing impossible presences, the moments of most intense conviction that something terrible was happening. These fragments arrive without context, without the surrounding narrative that might make them comprehensible, and with the full vividness that characterized the original experience. They feel more real than memory usually feels because they were laid down under conditions of extreme neurological arousal rather than in the ordinary course of conscious life. Survivors describe these fragments as being qualitatively different from ordinary memories, not faded, not uncertain, but sharp and immediate and presented without the usual contextual framing that tells you a memory is a memory rather than something happening right now. A face that was not there. A voice that said something specific. A room that was not the room you were actually in. These fragments arrive, unbidden, in the weeks after a Datura poisoning with the insistence of the original experience rather than the gentleness of a receding event. They are, in this sense, among the most lasting effects of the poisoning, small, isolated windows into a world that no longer exists and that you never wanted to visit in the first place. Medical follow-up for significant Datura poisoning is recommended but not always sought, partly because the patient frequently does not fully remember being poisoned and partly because the physical symptoms typically resolve within a few days, and the cognitive effects are diffuse enough to be easy to dismiss or attribute to something else. People go home from the hospital, feel better, and then notice over the following week that something is subtly off, attention slipping, memory for recent events unreliable, a vague and persistent unease that does not map onto anything specific. Most of this resolves. Most people return to their baseline, but the week or two that intervenes between the poisoning and the return to normal is a quiet, grey, disorienting time that does not feature prominently in the dramatic accounts of Datura's effects, but that everyone who's been through it seems to carry with them for a long time afterward. There is also something that is harder to name, something that survivors frequently gesture toward without being able to quite articulate. A change in the quality of ordinary reality after the experience. Not paranoia, not anxiety in the clinical sense, but a kind of subtle loosening of the assumption that the world you are perceiving corresponds to the world that is actually there. You knew this assumption existed only after it was taken away. You know it is back now, but you know, in a way you did not know before, that it can be removed, that it is a feature of a particular neurochemical state, rather than a feature of the universe. Most people would prefer not to know this. Datura teaches it anyway, and it does not offer a way to unlearn it. Sleep is good, sleep is safe, sleep is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, and it is, importantly, nothing at all like what we have just been talking about. To understand why Datura is so much more frightening than most mind-altering substances, it helps to understand what anticholinergic syndrome actually means. What is happening in the brain when its acetylcholine receptors are blocked on a massive scale? Acetylcholine is one of the nervous system's most fundamental neurotransmitters. It is involved in forming new memories, sustaining attention, filtering sensory input, and maintaining the basic architecture of conscious experience. When it is blocked throughout the brain simultaneously, consciousness doesn't simply change its content, it loses its structure. The mechanisms that distinguish the real from the imagined, the present from the absent, the self from the world, all of these become unreliable. The result is not a modified version of reality. It is reality's absence, replaced by something that has the full vividness and urgency of reality, but none of its coherence. Modern medicine can treat it. Ancient shamans contextualized it. But the experience itself, the raw neurological reality of it, is the same across every time, culture, and individual who has encountered it. The brain's filtering function is something most of us never notice because it works perfectly and continuously. Every moment of conscious experience involves the brain making rapid assessments about which of the enormous flood of incoming sensory information is real, relevant, and worth attending to, and which should be suppressed, deprioritized, or flagged as internally generated rather than externally real. This filtering is not a separate conscious process. You do not decide, moment by moment, whether the thing you are seeing is actually there. The determination is made before conscious awareness, automatically, by systems whose normal operation is invisible precisely because they work. Acetylcholine is deeply involved in this process, specifically in the thalamocortical gating mechanisms that regulate what gets through to conscious experience and what does not. When those mechanisms fail, everything gets through, equally, without filtering, without the quiet, constant verdict of the brain's reality-checking apparatus. What you imagine and what you perceive arrive with identical insistence, and there is no longer any way to tell which is which. This is clinically distinct from the mechanism of classical psychedelics, which primarily act on serotonin receptors and tend to produce distortions of perceptual content, things seen differently, intensified, made strange, while largely preserving the meta-awareness that the experience is unusual. A person on a high dose of psilocybin will typically know, at some level, that what they are seeing is not ordinary reality. This meta-awareness is not comfortable, but it is present, and it makes the experience navigable in a way that Datura's is not. Datura removes the meta-awareness entirely. There is no inner voice saying this is unusual. There is only the experience, and the experience is real, and there is nothing else. Consider what this means in practice. You see a person walk through the door. You recognize them. You speak to them. They respond. The conversation proceeds with complete internal logic. At no point during any of this does any part of your mind suggest that anything unusual is happening, because the part of your mind that makes that suggestion is offline. The person is simply there. The conversation is simply happening. And when the person disappears, you do not experience this as a revelation that they were never there. You experience it as them having left, and you proceed to look for them in the next room, with complete conviction, because of course they are in the next room. Where else would they be? This is why Datura delirium is so extraordinarily difficult to manage from the outside. You cannot talk someone out of a Datura experience the way you can sometimes talk someone through a difficult moment on other substances. There is no part of them available to receive the information that this is not real. The part that would receive that information, the part that performs the constant automatic reality checking that makes ordinary consciousness possible, is precisely the part that is not functioning. You're not talking to the person. You're talking to whatever the delirium has constructed in their place. And that construction is having a very different conversation with a very different person in a very different room. What this means neurologically is also what makes it so philosophically disturbing. Consciousness, the experience of being here, in this moment, in this body, in this world, is not a simple passive reception of what is actually happening. It is a construction, a continuous, automatic, extraordinarily sophisticated construction that the brain performs billions of times per second without your awareness or participation. Datura disrupts the construction, and when the construction fails, what remains is not nothing. What remains is another construction, equally convincing, equally insistent, equally experienced as real, but built entirely from within, with no external input at all. From the inside of that experience, you cannot tell the difference. That is the point. That is the terror. That is what the shamans were working with, what the emergency room physicians are managing, and what every single person who has ever taken this plant has discovered in the one way this discovery is reliably, consistently, and catastrophically made. There is no gentle introduction to this knowledge. There is only the experience, and the experience is the lesson. Throughout history, the possibility of using Datura as a weapon has not been lost on those with an interest in incapacitating enemies without immediately killing them. Beyond the accidental case of the Jamestown soldiers, there are documented and suspected uses of Datura in military and conflict contexts. In India, historical texts describe its use in food and water supplies to render enemy troops confused and incapable. In the colonial Americas, there are accounts of its deliberate use in the food of unwanted guests. In the 20th century, scopolamine, derived from Datura and related plants, was investigated as a potential truth serum by multiple intelligence agencies, including documented experiments by the United States government during the Cold War era. The logic was consistent. A drug that makes people confused, suggestible, talkative, and amnesiac about the experience afterward seemed, on paper, like a useful tool. In practice, it produced subjects who were too delirious to give reliable information. Datura, it turned out, does not make people honest. It makes people somewhere else entirely. The Cold War truth serum experiments are among the more thoroughly documented chapters of scopolamine's intelligence history, and they read, in retrospect, like a very expensive lesson in basic pharmacology that nobody needed to run because the answer was already available in 2,000 years of historical record. Intelligence agencies in the 1940s and 50s were intensely interested in chemical means of obtaining information from uncooperative subjects, a project that eventually became part of the CIA's notorious MKUltra program, which investigated everything from LSD to hypnosis to sensory deprivation in the pursuit of a reliable interrogation tool. Scopolamine was among the earliest substances investigated, partly because it already had a medical reputation and was therefore more accessible than classified compounds, and partly because its suggestibility-inducing and amnesiac effect seemed, in the briefing documents of people who had not actually experienced it, ideally suited to what they were trying to accomplish. The practical results were catastrophically unhelpful. A person under significant scopolamine influence is not relaxed and forthcoming. They are delirious. They are producing speech, yes, sometimes quite a lot of speech, with great conviction and considerable detail, but the content of that speech has no reliable relationship to actual stored memory or verifiable fact. They are confabulating. They are generating plausible-sounding narrative from the same associative, hallucinatory process that produces their visual hallucinations. The transcripts of scopolamine interrogations that have been made available through declassification are not repositories of actionable intelligence. They are documents of profound confusion, featuring responses that range from incoherent to fantastically inventive, almost none of which can be verified, and most of which bear no relationship to actual events. The drug that was supposed to remove the ability to lie simultaneously removed the ability to tell the truth, because both of those things require a functioning connection to reality, and scopolamine had severed that connection entirely. This is the same lesson that the ancient Indian legal texts could have provided, if anyone had thought to read them with this question in mind. The plant is excellent at making people talk. It is completely useless at making people accurate. A person given, Datura will tell you about the people in the room who are not there, the events happening that are not happening, the places they have visited that they have never been. They will tell you these things with conviction and emotional investment and specific detail, and none of it will be actionable, and there is no way to tell which parts, if any, correspond to anything real. In terms of direct military use, as an area denial or battlefield incapacitation agent delivered to enemy forces, Datura's practical limitations compound rapidly. The dosing problem that makes it dangerous in individual encounters becomes an insurmountable planning problem at scale. You cannot reliably incapacitate a fighting force with a compound whose effective dose varies by a factor of 5 between individuals and whose lethal dose is not reliably distinguishable from its effective dose. You cannot deploy something that takes between 30 minutes and 2 hours to produce effects, has a duration of action ranging from 8 hours to 3 days, and kills people at the upper end of its dose range with insufficient predictability to plan around. The Jamestown soldiers survived. Not everyone does. A military operation that incapacitates some of its targets, kills others, and drives the remainder into 3 days of unpredictable wandering is not a military operation. It is disaster with extra steps. The ancient Indian military strategists who wrote about Datura as a tactical tool were observing something real, a substance that, delivered covertly to a small number of individuals, could render them helpless. That is true. The gap between that observation and a reliable weapon system is the gap between a scalpel and a weather event. The plant cooperates on its own terms. It always has. And its terms have never included being useful in the way anyone needed. In the age of the internet, the archive of first-person Datura accounts is vast, searchable, and remarkably consistent to a degree that speaks to the pharmacological universality of the experience regardless of the cultural context in which it occurs. Modern survivors describe the experience not as a trip, but as a deletion. They describe waking up in their own homes not knowing how they arrived. They describe holding conversations with people who, when they looked again, were not there. They describe performing tasks, making phone calls, sending messages, walking to a store during the delirium that they have later confirmed actually occurred, with no memory of doing them. They describe a quality of the hallucinations that is consistently described as more real than real, not dreamlike, not soft, but solid, three-dimensional, and convincing. And they almost universally describe a sense, upon recovery, that something has happened that cannot be entirely undone. Not trauma in the clinical sense necessarily, but a knowledge, intimate and impossible to share, of what it is like when the machinery of consciousness stops working. One of the most striking features of modern Datura accounts is the consistent appearance of what survivors call the cigarette. It is almost a ritual element of the experience at this point, something that appears in account after account across different countries and different ages and completely different circumstances, with a uniformity that no cultural contamination can fully explain. The person in the Datura state finds themselves smoking a cigarette. They can feel it between their fingers with complete tactile conviction. They can see the ember. They can bring it to their lips and feel the draw of smoke that is not there. And then they look at their hand, and there is nothing there. So they reach into their pocket and find another cigarette and light it. The lighter is there, solid, heavy, clicking with a satisfying sound, and begin smoking again. And then they look at their hand, and there is nothing there. This repeats and repeats and repeats for hours, with complete conviction at every iteration. The cigarette is never there. They never stop looking for it. This is not a coincidence between accounts. It is a demonstration of the perseverative quality of anticholinergic delirium, the tendency to repeat a purposeful action without the ability to update behavior based on its consistently failing result. The person is not confused about what they are doing. They are smoking a cigarette. They are perfectly certain of this. The fact that the cigarette keeps not being there does not register as information. It registers as an interruption, and then the action begins again. If you have ever watched someone in a Datura delirium go through this cycle, you have witnessed one of the clearest possible demonstrations of what it means for the brain's reality, updating function to be completely offline. The feedback loop that would ordinarily say, the cigarette is not there, revise your model, stop reaching, has been cut. The action simply continues. The phone calls and text messages are another feature of modern accounts that deserves its own moment, and one of the more quietly haunting dimensions of the contemporary Datura experience. People in Datura delirium frequently contact people in their lives, texting, calling, sending voice messages that contain content completely disconnected from ordinary communication. The messages range from confused to alarming to surreal. They describe things happening that are not happening. They ask for help in ways that do not correspond to any help that can be given from a distance. They contain the specific, convinced detail of someone reporting real events, and the person sending them has in most cases no memory of having done so whatsoever. Family members and friends have described receiving these messages and calls in real time, hearing the person's voice describe impossible things with complete confidence, trying to respond in ways that make sense, not knowing that what they are. Witnessing is a pharmacological event rather than a mental collapse. The reconstruction afterward, comparing notes between the person who sent the messages and the people who received them, matching the delirium's internal narrative against the external record of what was actually happening, is consistently described as one of the most disorienting parts of the aftermath. There is a record of 3 days in your phone. None of it is yours. All of it happened. You were there for none of it. The gap between those facts is where the real horror lives. What the modern accounts collectively produce is a testimony, not to the horror of a single extreme event, but to the discovery that the experience of being a conscious self in a real world is a construction, that it can fail, that when it fails, it does not fail quietly or partially, but completely and absolutely, replacing itself with another construction that is indistinguishable from the original. Datura does not teach this lesson gently. It does not offer a preview, a consent form, or a way back before you're already there. It simply removes the floor and you find out all at once that you are standing on it. Tonight, right now, Datura is blooming somewhere. Its white trumpets are opening in the dark in the American Southwest, in the fields of India, in the vacant lots of European cities, in the disturbed earth of Australian farmland. It has been blooming, in one form or another, for millions of years, long before any human existed to reach for it. And yet, since the first moment a human being encountered it, we have been reaching for it, with caution, with reverence, with ritual, with curiosity, with recklessness, with hunger for something on the other side of ordinary experience. This plant has killed people. It has broken people. It has also, in the right hands and the right context, been used to heal, to initiate, to grieve, to communicate with whatever lies beyond the edges of the knowable. What it tells us, perhaps, is something uncomfortable about ourselves, that the desire to touch the edge of consciousness, to find out what is on the other side of the ordinary mind, is one of the oldest and most persistent human impulses there is. Datura has been answering that impulse in its own terrifying way for as long as we have been here to ask. The plant is not listed as a controlled substance in most jurisdictions. This is partly because its effects are so consistently catastrophic that it has never developed a meaningful recreational market. There is no demand outside of the occasional catastrophically misinformed individual for something this reliably terrible, and partly because it is so widely distributed and so freely growing that controlling it would be effectively impossible anyway. It is in your garden, or someone nearby's garden right now. It is growing on the highway median you drove past last weekend. It is in the waste ground behind the supermarket, in the disturbed soil beside, the construction site, in the untended corner of the park that nobody bothers to maintain. It is in the world, fully accessible, entirely unregulated, and the only thing standing between a person and a Datura poisoning is the knowledge of what it is and what it does. That knowledge is more available now than it has ever been in human history. The internet has made it possible to look at a photograph of Datura, identify it by name, and within minutes access 200 first-person accounts of what happens when it is ingested, written by people who are very clearly not recommending it. The warnings are comprehensive. The consensus is total and consistent across every discipline that has ever examined the plant: botany, toxicology, emergency medicine, anthropology, pharmacology, and the accumulated testimony of every surviving individual who has encountered it. Ancient priests said, handle this with reverence and fear. Aztec healers said only specialists should touch this. Chumash elders said this requires years of training to approach safely. Medieval herbalists said this will make you mad. Modern toxicologists say do not take this under any circumstances. Emergency physicians agree. Poison control agrees. Every survivor agrees. The plant does not have enthusiasts. It has cautionary tales. Those are different things, and Datura has been generating the latter for a very long time, and yet every year the calls come in. Every year the emergency rooms see the presentations. Every year someone reaches for it, not always out of ignorance, sometimes with full knowledge of what they're doing, drawn by the same ancient and irresistible impulse that has been driving human beings toward dangerous edges since before written history. The impulse that says, I want to know. I want to see what is on the other side. This is not stupidity. This is not weakness. It is one of the most purely human things there is, the same impulse that built the pyramids and mapped the constellations and sent ships over the horizon into waters no one had ever charted. It is just, in this particular application, aimed at something that does not reward curiosity, that does not offer insight in exchange for the risk, that takes everything and gives back almost nothing except, if you are lucky, your life and a few weeks of fog and a memory you cannot quite place. What Datura tells us about ourselves, across all of these stories and all of these centuries, is that we are a species willing to put our minds at risk for the possibility of seeing something we have never seen before. That impulse has produced some of the greatest achievements in human history. It has also, in this specific and recurring context, produced a reliable parade of hospitalizations across every culture that has ever grown this plant in its soil. The cost of curiosity is usually effort, time, and occasional disappointment. With Datura, the cost is measured in hospital beds, in missing days, in messages you sent to people you love that you will never remember writing, in the specific and lasting knowledge that the flaw of consciousness can be removed. That is a high price. It has always been a high price. It will continue to be a high price. The plant does not negotiate. It blooms at dusk. It closes at dawn. It drops its seeds into the soil and comes back the following year, entirely unchanged, carrying the same chemistry it has always carried, indifferent to every human being who has ever reached toward it, with curiosity or reverence or desperation, or the simple, terrible need to find out. The priests and the healers, and the frightened teenagers, and the CIA analysts and the Jamestown soldiers all tried to make it into something. It was never trying to be anything. It is a plant. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. We are the variable. We have always been the variable. It is still there. It is blooming right now. And somewhere in the dark someone is looking at the flowers and thinking, how bad could it be? Now you know. Now close your eyes. And so, here we are. You have travelled a long way tonight, through ancient temples in India, where priests left white flowers at the feet of a god who understood destruction, through the desert ceremonies of the Chumash, where boys went to meet a grandmother who lived inside a root and came back, if they came back, as men, through the smoky kitchens of medieval Europe, where women rubbed ointments onto their skin and flew to places that were entirely real to them, through a courtyard in Jamestown, Virginia, where a group of British soldiers spent 11 days blowing feathers at each other and remembered nothing, through emergency rooms and Cold War intelligence files and internet forums and the quiet grey weeks of people putting themselves back together after something they cannot quite describe and will never entirely forget. You've spent the night with one of the oldest, strangest, most consistently terrifying plants in human history, and it has never once tried to be any of those things. It was just there, blooming every evening in the dark, doing exactly what it was made to do, entirely indifferent to every human being who ever looked at it and decided to reach. That reaching is what stays with you, isn't it? Not the plant. The reaching. Because across every story we told tonight, the sacred and the accidental, the ancient and the modern, the carefully ritualized and the catastrophically reckless, the one constant was not the plant. The plant was always the same. The constant was the human being standing in front of it, wanting to know what was on the other side of the ordinary world. Wanting it badly enough to risk the only mind they had. That is not a small thing to want, and it is not a shameful thing to want. It is in fact one of the most profound and ancient forms of human courage, the willingness to walk toward the edge of what the mind can survive in the hope of bringing something back. The Chumash elders who supervised those ceremonies were not being reckless. They were honouring something real, the human need to experience something larger than the ordinary self. The Aztec healers who worked with this plant for generations were not being primitive. They were being careful stewards of a knowledge that was genuinely dangerous and genuinely powerful and genuinely worth protecting. They understood something we sometimes forget in the modern world, where the edge of experience has been made so accessible and so uncontextualized, that the most powerful things require the most careful handling, that danger without wisdom is not courage, and that some doors, once you have walked through them, do not close behind you as neatly as they opened. The people who did not survive their encounters with Datura, and there have been many, across many centuries and many cultures, were not foolish. They were human, they were curious and desperate and searching, the way human beings have always been curious and desperate and searching. They deserved better frameworks. They deserved the knowledge that the Chumash elders carried, the caution that the Aztec healers practiced, the accumulated wisdom of communities that had spent generations learning how to be near this plant without being destroyed by it. Most of them did not have that, and so they reached, and the plant answered in the only way it knows how. Tonight, as you feel yourself drifting, as the fan hums and the room settles and the ordinary world reassembles itself gently around you in the dark, take a moment to feel how solid it is, how reliably present, how the ceiling is the ceiling and the bed is the bed, and the people you love are exactly where you last placed them in your mind, real and located and permanent in all the ways that matter. Your acetylcholine receptors are functioning perfectly. Your thalamocortical gating mechanisms are quietly doing their job. Your brain is building reality moment by moment with the same effortless competence it has always had. You will not notice it doing this. That is the point. That is the gift. Somewhere tonight, a white trumpet flower is opening in the dark. It is beautiful. It has always been beautiful. It will be beautiful long after every human being who has ever written about it, or feared it, or reached for it, has turned to dust. The moths will come for it in the dark, as they always have, drawn by something they were built to follow. And the flower will do what it has always done, offer exactly what it is, nothing more and nothing less to whatever arrives. You do not need to arrive. You're already exactly where you should be. Close your eyes. The plant is outside. You are in here, and in here tonight, everything is exactly as real as it looks. Sleep well.